Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is mash. Let's take a moment to review some of the definitions or the ways that we use this verb. The first way you might encounter the verb mash is in connection to cooking. It is frequently used to talk about crushing or smashing something into a pulp. Right? So making sure you can't really see its original form, right? Really strongly pressing on it repeatedly many times. With this first definition, many people will think of mashed potatoes and that idea that the potatoes have been cooked until they can be soft and can be pressed into that idea of a pulp. A second way the verb mash gets used can mean to press something forcefully. I heard this verb used in this way recently when someone had their hand in a doorway and the door closed, and they're like, that door mashed my fingers. It really pressed it with a great deal of force or strength. A third way you might hear mash used can mean to flirt with someone else or seek their affection. Now, this third definition is not very common in the United States, but if you are learning English to use it in the United Kingdom, you might encounter it more in England. I know I've seen it and heard it in British movies or TV shows. So that is another way to use this verb. But for now, let's talk about how mash is a regular verb. This means to make the progressive form of the verb, all we need to do is add ing, and that forms mashing. The past tense and participle forms of this verb can be made by adding ed. Our base verb, mash, ends in an unvoiced sound. So that sh is an unvoiced sound in English, and this means the ed ending is going to make a t sound, and I'm not going to add an extra syllable as I say it. So the past tense and the participle forms of the verb should sound like this: mashed, mashed. Okay? Now, there are a few phrasal verbs that we can discuss. The first is to mash up. When we use this, many times we're talking about combining two or more audio recordings, video recordings. This has really become kind of an art form, some people would say. So let's look at an example sentence. Danger Mouse mashed up Jay-Z's The Black Album and the Beatles' The White Album to produce the Gray Album. Okay. Now, this sentence might not make a lot of sense if you're not a big fan of music, and frankly, this is 20 or more years old now, but I thought it was a really good example. So this particular individual combined the words from Jay-Z and some of the music from the Beatles' The White Album, and kind of the idea here of mixing black and white produce gray. Right? So that's how we get the third name. So I combined these different audio recordings to make something kind of new and interesting. And if you like either one, either Jay-Z's music or the Beatles' music, I would encourage you check that out. Was something I really enjoyed listening to again a long time ago. Another phrasal verb you might encounter is to mash with. This can have several different meanings. One way to use it goes back to our original definition of crushing or smashing something with a particular tool. An example of this might be, will you mash the avocado with this fork, right? So you can kind of picture, maybe in your mind, taking the utensil of fork, right, and really pressing on the avocado. A second way to use mash with can mean to crush or smash multiple ingredients together in order to produce some kind of mixture. An example of this might be, mash the berries with 2 tablespoons of sugar. Right? So here, maybe we're making something for a particular dessert, right? The sentence sounds like it's from the recipe instructions, kind of telling us what to do. The last way you might hear mash with used can mean to combine different elements, but we're combining them in sort of an awkward or clumsy type of way. An example of this might be, this new movie mashed comedy with horror to create a confusing performance. So this sentence was borrowed from a review. So someone watched a particular movie, then sharing his or her thoughts about what they saw and if they think other people should go see it, right? And here, right, they're kind of talking about, normally you might think, I'm going to watch a comedy or I'm going to watch a movie that's described as a horror film, right? And here we're really talking about combining it, but this particular reviewer did not find it to be very good. So it just confused people who were watching it. That's what the sentence indicates. Now, let's talk a little bit about using our verb of the day in a couple different verb tenses. Today we'll review the simple present and the present perfect. Let's start with the simple present. We use this verb tense to talk about our habits and routines. We also use it to discuss facts and feelings. The trickiest thing about remembering how to make simple present tense sentences is that we have to pay attention to our subject. So when we go to make an affirmative sentence, if our subject is I, you, we, or they, we just use the base verb. We don't add any suffixes or special endings to the verb. But if our subject is he, she, or it, we are going to add an es to the end of the verb here. And you can actually see that in my example here. She mashes the bananas before mixing in the flour. Right? So again, maybe we're talking about a particular dish, maybe it's some banana bread, and we're describing the process, right? Her habit or her routine when she bakes or makes this particular recipe. So notice, because I'm talking about one woman here, I've added an es to the end of the verb. Now let's talk about making negative sentences in the simple present tense. Again, we've got to pay attention to our subject. If our subject is I, you, we, or they, use do not and then the base verb. You might also see the contraction don't and then the base verb. But if the subject is he, she, or it, use does not or doesn't and then the base verb. So notice here in the negative, I'm not adding es to the end of the verb. Okay? Let's take a look at the example I have on the screen. They don't mash the avocados when making guacamole. I actually heard this sentence recently when I was watching a particular program who was profiling a restaurant and kind of describing some of the restaurant's unique dishes. So they said this was kind of special, kind of different. Normally, right, that sort of thing gets smashed, but this particular restaurant, they cut the avocado into small pieces, but they did not mash it or press it firmly. Now, let's talk about making a yes or no question in the simple present. To do this, we start with do or does, whichever form matches our subject. That subject comes next. Then we use the base verb. So again, notice how I'm not using that es form of the verb. I'm only doing that in the affirmative when my subject is he, she, or it. Let's take a look at the last simple present example. Do you mash the potatoes with milk or cream? So here, someone is likely asking for maybe some advice, or maybe they're just kind of interested in your particular recipe for mashed potatoes. Now let's move on and look at some sentences in the present perfect. We can use this verb tense in a couple different ways. One is to talk about an action that started in the past and continues into the present. Or we can use it to describe an action that was completed at an unknown point in the past. Many times, this gets called the indefinite past tense. Again, when we make sentences in the present perfect, we need to pay attention to our subjects. If the subject of the sentence is I, you, we, or they, use have and then the ed form of the verb, since this is a regular verb. But if our subject is he, she, or it, use has and then the ed form of the verb. Let's take a look at an example sentence. They've mashed up rap and country music to produce this song. Right? So we're back to that earlier example of combining two or more audio recordings. So you might take a rap song and a country song and combine them to make something else. Now, if you want to make a negative present perfect sentence, again, pay attention to your subject. Right? Then you're going to use have or has, then not, and then the participle form of the verb. You might also notice the contractions have not being shortened into haven't, or has not to hasn't, but each time they'll be followed by the participle or ed form of the verb. Here's another example. He hasn't mashed the squash yet. So squash is a type of vegetable, and again, you can see many of my examples here are connected to food, and there's a reason for that. As I looked for examples of this verb, many of them were connected to food. So there's a bit of an expectation. You're going to notice, actually in my negative and my yes or no question example in the present perfect, I've used that word yet. Really common to hear in negatives or questions. Many times we're using this to express that there's an expectation that this action will be completed, and we're wanting to know. We might not care when it was completed. We just want to know if it has been completed. So let's look at that process now for making a yes or no question. To do that, you start with have or has, whichever form matches your subject. That subject comes next, and then the participle form of the verb. Here's another one. Have you mashed the apples yet? And so again, maybe you're cooking with someone, right? And you want to know, has this action been completed? Now let's spend a moment looking at some words that are related to our verb mash. The first word we're going to discuss today is just the noun form of this word. The noun has the exact same spelling and the exact same pronunciation. When we use the word mash as a noun, we're generally referring to that substance, that thing that we have made by crushing or smashing something into that soft, pulp-like substance. An example of this might be, make a mash of the garlic cloves. Again, this might be a sentence you find in a recipe, providing kind of the steps in order to make a particular dish, right? So they want you to press and smash the garlic cloves, right? Until, and maybe sometimes as we do this, you might add a little bit of water to make that crushing process a little bit easier. Another related word you might encounter is the noun masher. This could refer to a person, but more commonly, it's many times referring to a thing that crushes or smashes, that mashes. So an example of this, do you already have a potato masher? Right? Now, this might be a new term, so to help us understand it better, I've included a picture at the bottom, in the bottom right-hand corner of my screen. This would be one example. There are many different forms of potato mashers out there, but this is the tool someone would use to really press and crush cooked potatoes in order to make particular dishes. And you could crush or mash other vegetables, other things with that tool, but at least in the United States, particularly in the Midwest where I live, potatoes are things that are frequently mashed. I've got one more related word for us to talk about. It's another noun. And this noun has a hyphen in it, mash up. So you might be thinking back to our phrasal verb from earlier in the video, and that's great. So here we're talking about something that is being made by combining two or more elements from other sources. So an example of this might be, the new Spotify tool will allow users to make mashups inside the platform. So I actually saw this in a news article this week. If this is an app you use, you might be familiar with it, but it'd be that idea of combining two or more audio recordings here to make something kind of new, different, and many times it's meant to entertain others. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you have a great day.